This morning, as the sun rises without asking our permission and the birds lift their songs without a single lesson in faith, we are reminded of a sacred truth. Not everything that matters must first be explained. Some things must be trusted. Some things must be obeyed. We come into this morning prayer carrying questions in our pockets and worries in our bones. We want clarity before commitment, answers before action, understanding before obedience. But God, in His quiet and eternal wisdom, often asks us to walk before we can see the road, to step before we know the destination, to obey before we understand everything. Obey God first before you understand everything. This is not a call to blind fear, but an invitation to deep faith. It is the kind of faith that wakes up early, kneels low, and says, "Lord, I do not see the whole picture, but I trust the artist." This morning prayer is a gentle but powerful reminder that obedience is not the end of thought, it is the beginning of transformation. When we choose God first, understanding will follow in its own time, like light slowly filling a room. Obedience has often been misunderstood, dressed in the heavy garments of fear and mistaken for surrender of the mind, mistaken for silence, mistaken for weakness. But obedience to God, true obedience, is none of those things. It is not the bending of the spirit until it breaks, but the straightening of the soul until it stands tall. It is the quiet courage to say, "I trust you," when the ground beneath your feet feels unfamiliar and the sky refuses to give you a map. To obey God before understanding everything is to place your heart and hands larger than your own. It is to believe that wisdom existed before your questions were ever formed, that love was working on your behalf long before you learned how to ask. Obedience is not the absence of thought. It is the presence of faith. It is not ignorance, it is reverence. It is not weakness, it is strength that has learned how to kneel. We live in a world that demands explanations. We are taught to ask why before we say yes, to demand proof before we offer trust, to calculate outcomes before we commit our steps. And yet God often calls us to move without giving us the whole story. He speaks softly into the dawn of our lives and says, "Follow me, not understand me completely." Obedience then becomes the bridge between who we are and who we are becoming. There are moments in life when the heart understands what the mind cannot yet explain. In those moments, obedience rises like a quiet hymn inside the chest. It says, "I do not see the whole road, but I know the one who paved it." That kind of obedience is not passive, it is active trust. It is waking up each morning and choosing God again even when yesterday left you with unanswered prayers and unhealed questions. Obedience is an act of trust because it acknowledges God's character. It declares that He is faithful even when circumstances are not, that He is present even when silence fills the room. To obey God is to believe that His intentions are rooted in love, not harm, and purpose, not confusion. It is to lean into the truth that God's wisdom stretches beyond the limits of human understanding, and His vision reaches further than our sight. Trust is not built in moments of ease. It is forged in uncertainty. When God asks us to forgive before we feel ready, to wait when we want to run, to give when we feel empty, obedience becomes a testimony. It says to the world and to our own trembling hearts, "I believe God knows what He is doing." That belief is not weak, it is brave. There is strength in obedience that the loud world does not recognize. It takes strength to obey when pride demands control. It takes strength to obey when fear whispers disaster. It takes strength to obey when logic insists on evidence and emotion insists on comfort. Obedience chooses God's voice over the noise, God's promise over personal preference. Some of the strongest people who have ever lived learned how to obey God before they learned how to explain Him. They walked into unknown futures, guided only by faith, and history later called them courageous. But in the moment they were simply obedient. They trusted God enough to move their feet even when their hands were shaking. Obedience teaches us humility, not humiliation. It reminds us that we are not the center of the universe, but we are deeply loved within it. When we obey God, we release the exhausting burden of having to know everything. We stop pretending we are self-sufficient and admit that we need guidance, grace, and mercy. And in that admission, we find freedom. Morning prayer becomes the sacred place where obedience is renewed. In the quiet hours before the world makes its demands, obedience whispers, "Lord, I am here." Not with all the answers, not with perfect faith, but with a willing heart. Morning obedience does not require clarity, it requires surrender. It says, "God, lead me today even if I don't understand where you are taking me." Trust grows through obedience like roots grow underground, unseen, unnoticed, but essential. You may not feel strong when you obey God in uncertainty, but strength is being built in you all the same. Every obedient step deepens your reliance on God and loosens your grip on fear. Every obedient prayer stretches your faith beyond what is comfortable into what is transformative. Obedience is also an act of hope. It believes that God's tomorrow is worth trusting even when today feels incomplete. It believes that what does not make sense now will one day make meaning. Obedience is the seed you plant before you see the harvest, the song you sing before the joy arrives, the prayer you pray before the answer comes. To obey God first is to say, "I trust your heart even when I do not understand your hand." It is to believe that God is not asking you to walk blindly, but to walk faithfully. He is not asking you to abandon reason, but to allow faith to lead reason into deeper truth. In obedience, we do not lose ourselves, we find ourselves. We discover who we are when we stop trying to be in control and start allowing God to be God. We learn that obedience is not the end of freedom, but the beginning of peace. So let obedience rise this morning, not as a heavy command, but as a loving response. Let it rise as trust, quiet and unshakable. Let it rise as strength clothed in humility. For when we obey God before understanding everything, we are not walking in weakness, we are walking in faith, and faith has always been powerful enough to move mountains. Faith has never waited politely for permission from understanding. It moves first with bare feet and an open heart, stepping onto roads that have not yet learned our names. Explanation likes to arrive with charts and conclusions, with neat endings and logical bows. Faith arrives with courage instead. It says, "I will go," long before it says, "I will know." From the beginning of every meaningful journey, faith has always been the one to lead. It does not demand the full map. It trusts the guide. It does not ask for guarantees. It leans on promise. Faith understands that some truths are too wide for words and some directions are too deep for immediate clarity. So it walks not because the path is visible, but because the calling is clear. We are taught to believe that understanding should come first. We want to know where the road ends before we place our foot upon it. We want assurance before obedience and evidence before trust. But God often asks us to move while the picture is still forming, to step forward while the fog has not yet lifted. Faith is not reckless, it is responsive. It responds to God's voice even when the reasons remain quiet. There is a holy courage in moving without explanation. It is the courage to trust that God sees what we cannot see and knows what we cannot yet comprehend. Faith walks ahead of explanation because explanation is often the reward of obedience, not the requirement. Understanding follows those who are willing to move, not those who stand still waiting for certainty. When faith steps out, it does so humbly. It admits that it does not know everything and does not need to. It rests in the assurance that God's wisdom exceeds human reasoning. This humility is not ignorance, it is reverence. It acknowledges that the Creator's vision is broader than the creation's perspective. There are seasons when God gives direction without detail. He says, "Go," without revealing the destination. He says, "Trust me," without explaining the process. In these moments, faith becomes the bridge between the present and the promise. Each step taken in faith strengthens the bridge beneath our feet. Faith walking ahead of explanation teaches us reliance. It strips away self-sufficiency and replaces it with dependence on God. We learn to listen more closely, to pray more earnestly, to lean more fully on divine guidance. Without complete understanding, we stay connected, attentive, and humble. Some of the greatest transformations in life begin with a step that did not make sense at the time. A decision to forgive when the wound is still open. A choice to wait when opportunity calls loudly. A commitment to give when resources feel thin. These acts are not logical in the moment, but they are faithful. and faith over time reveals their wisdom. Faith also protects us from paralysis. If we waited to understand everything before moving, we would remain forever in the same place. Explanation can become a hiding place for fear, a respectable disguise for hesitation. Faith gently exposes this and says, you do not need to know everything to take the next step. As faith walks, understanding begins to catch up. Clarity arrives in pieces like light breaking through clouds. We begin to see why the step was necessary, why the timing mattered, why the delay or the movement served a purpose. What once confused us begins to instruct us. Faith walking ahead does not mean abandoning reason. It means allowing reason to follow faith into deeper truth. When the heart trusts God, the mind becomes open to learning. Understanding that arrives after obedience is often richer and more transformative than understanding demanded beforehand. Morning prayer becomes the place where faith is renewed. Each morning we choose again to walk by faith and not by sight. We say, God, I will follow you today, even if I do not understand where you are leading. In that surrender, the day is placed in God's hands. Faith also teaches us patience with the unfolding process. We stop rushing God for explanations and start trusting Him with outcomes. We learn that not every question needs an immediate answer, and not every mystery needs to be solved to be meaningful. There is beauty in a faith that walks ahead. It carries hope into uncertain places. It brings light into situations that logic has already declared impossible. Faith believes that God is already present in the future we are walking toward. Over time, faith builds testimony. What once felt like a blind step becomes a story of divine faithfulness. We look back and see that God was guiding us all along, even when we did not recognize the path. Faith walked ahead, an explanation followed behind, nodding in agreement. To live by faith is to accept that some understanding will come later and some will remain with God. It is to trust that what we need to know God will reveal in His time. Faith frees us from the burden of knowing everything and invites us into the peace of trusting someone who does. So let faith lead. Let it walk ahead of explanation with confidence and humility. Let it take the step that logic hesitates to approve. For faith does not walk alone. God walks with it. And where faith goes first, understanding will one day arrive, wiser, deeper, and wrapped in grace. There are hours in our lives when logic sits at the table with its papers neatly stacked, its calculations precise, its arguments persuasive, and still something deeper calls us to wait. God's timing does not rush to meet our reasoning, nor does it pause to explain itself to our impatience. It moves with a sacred rhythm, steady and intentional, like the beating of a heart that knows how long life must grow before it can breathe on its own. We are people trained to measure time in minutes and outcomes in milestones. We want progress we can point to, answers we can chart, blessings we can schedule. But God's timing does not wear a wristwatch. It is not hurried by our anxiety nor delayed by our doubts. It unfolds with purpose, often invisible at first, often misunderstood, until the lesson has already taken root. There are moments when God says, wait, and logic protests. Logic says the door is open now. Logic says the opportunity is slipping away. Logic says time is running out. But God says, be still, and in that stillness something holy is happening. What feels like delay is often divine preparation. What feels like silence is often instruction spoken too deep for noise. Waiting on God is not wasted time. It is sacred time. It is the season when faith learns how to breathe without proof, and hope learns how to stand without applause. God's timing shapes us in ways that immediate answers never could. It strengthens patience, sharpens discernment, and softens the heart to hear what cannot be shouted. We often ask God for clarity, but He gives us character. We ask for speed, but He gives us strength. We ask for results, but He gives us roots. God's timing is not designed to frustrate us. It is designed to form us. The blessing is not only in what God gives, but in who we become while waiting. There is a wisdom in God's delay that logic cannot calculate. Logic looks at the present moment. God sees the whole story. Logic evaluates what is possible now. God knows what will be sustainable later. What we rush into may crumble under its own weight, but what God prepares in His time is built to last. Sometimes God waits until we are ready to receive without pride, to steward without fear, to love without condition. He waits until our hands are strong enough to hold the blessing and our hearts humble enough not to worship it. God's timing protects us from receiving too soon. What could harm us if we received it unprepared? There are prayers we thank God for answering late. There are doors we later praise Him for keeping closed. At the moment it felt like denial, like neglect, like abandonment. But hindsight reveals mercy. God's timing saved us from paths we were not ready to walk, and from versions of ourselves we were not ready to be. Faith grows when logic reaches its limit. When there is no spreadsheet for hope and no formula for peace, faith steps forward and says, "I will trust you anyway." That trust is not naive, it is learned through surrender. It is built in the quiet obedience of waiting when everything in us wants to move. God's timing teaches us that not everything delayed is denied. Some things are ripening. Some things are waiting for us to become who we need to be in order to handle what we are asking for. The fruit is sweeter when it is picked in season, and God knows the season of every promise. Morning prayer becomes an act of alignment with God's timing. Each morning we release our schedules into His hands and confess that our urgency is not greater than His wisdom. We say, "Lord, order my steps today, even if they move slower than I want." In that prayer we learn peace that does not depend on speed. There is beauty in the slow unfolding of God's will. Like a sunrise that refuses to be rushed, God's timing brings light at the precise moment it is needed. Too early and it would blind us. Too late and we would stumble. God knows when the soul is ready for illumination. Logic asks for guarantees. God asks for trust. Logic wants certainty. God offers promise. And promise, held in faith, outlasts every calculation. When we obey God's timing, we step into a flow that carries us beyond our own understanding and into His divine order. Some of our greatest breakthroughs come after the longest waits. Not because God was absent, but because He was intentional. The waiting season teaches us how to pray without panic, how to hope without haste, how to love God for who He is and not just for what He gives. To trust God's timing is to rest in the truth that He is never late. He arrives exactly when His purpose requires Him to arrive. And when He moves, everything moves with Him. Doors open, hearts change, paths clear. So let us lay our logic gently at God's feet, not as an enemy, but as a servant. Let faith lead where logic cannot go. Let patience rise where urgency once ruled. For God's timing is not an obstacle to our destiny, it is the pathway. And when we finally understand what once confused us, we will see that every delay, every pause, every quiet moment was God working all things together for good. Before understanding ever finds its language, the heart is already listening. Long before the mind gathers its evidence and builds its arguments, the heart leans toward what feels true, what feels holy, what feels right. God knows this order well. That is why obedience does not begin in the intellect, it begins in the inner chambers of the soul where motives are formed and intentions take root. God shapes the heart first because the heart is the doorway through which wisdom must pass. We often believe that if we can just understand enough, we will obey. We tell ourselves that clarity will bring commitment, that explanation will produce surrender. But God, in His patient knowing, understands that knowledge without humility can harden the spirit. So He invites obedience before explanation, not to withhold truth, but to prepare us to receive it rightly. A softened heart can hold truth without weaponizing it. A humbled heart can receive wisdom without pride. Obedience reshapes the heart by teaching it how to trust. Each time we say yes to God without fully understanding the outcome, the heart learns that it is safe to rely on Him. Trust grows quietly, like a muscle strengthened by consistent use. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself in peace, where anxiety once lived, and in courage where fear once spoke the loudest. The heart is where resistance hides. It is where wounds whisper caution and disappointment builds walls. God does not ignore these places. He meets them with gentle instruction through obedience. When we obey, even trembling, God begins to heal what skepticism has scarred. Obedience is not about suppressing doubt. It is about choosing God despite it, and in that choice the heart begins to heal. There is a tenderness that obedience cultivates. It teaches the heart how to listen instead of argue, how to surrender instead of strive. In obedience, the heart learns patience because it must wait on God rather than rush ahead of Him. It learns humility because it acknowledges that it does not know everything and does not have to. This humility is not self-diminishing, it is self-honoring because it places the soul in alignment with truth. The mind often wants to be convinced. The heart wants to be formed. God attends to both, but He begins with the heart, because a shaped heart can guide a searching mind. Without heart transformation, understanding becomes information without application. But when the heart is obedient, understanding becomes wisdom, alive, active, and life-giving. Obedience purifies the heart's intentions. It strips away the need to control outcomes and replaces it with the desire to please God. This is not about performance or perfection, it is about alignment. When the heart is aligned with God, motives become clearer, desires become cleaner, and decisions become steadier. We stop asking only, "What do I want?" and begin asking, "What honors God?" There are prayers that do not change circumstances, but change the heart. Obedience often works this way. The situation may look the same on the outside, but inside something has shifted. Fear loosens its grip. Bitterness softens. Resentment fades. In obedience, God does heart work that no amount of reasoning could accomplish. The heart that obeys learns compassion. It becomes less quick to judge and more willing to understand. Obedience teaches us that we too are learning, growing, and being shaped. This awareness breeds grace for ourselves and for others. We become patient with people's process because we recognize our own. Morning prayer becomes the workshop of the heart. In the quiet hours before the mind fills with plans and problems, obedience invites the heart to submit itself anew. We say, "Lord, shape me today, not just my thoughts, but my reactions, not just my understanding, but my spirit." In that prayer, God begins His delicate transformative work. As the heart is shaped, the mind begins to follow. Understanding comes not as a demand, but as a gift. Truth settles more deeply because it lands in a heart already prepared to receive it. God does not overwhelm us with knowledge all at once. He unfolds it in step with our obedience. Each act of surrender opens the door to greater insight. Obedience also guards the heart. It keeps it from being ruled by impulse, ego, or fear. When the heart learns to submit to God, it becomes less vulnerable to deception and distraction. It learns discernment, not just knowing what is right, but feeling when something is wrong. This discernment is born not from suspicion, but from intimacy with God. There is a beauty in a heart shaped by obedience. It carries a quiet confidence, a settled peace, a gentle strength. It does not need to dominate conversations or win arguments. It knows who it belongs to. It trusts God enough to wait, enough to listen, enough to obey. To obey God before understanding everything is to allow Him to work where change matters most. The mind may still have questions, but the heart has found its anchor. And in time, understanding will arrive not as a stranger, but as a familiar friend. So let the heart be shaped first. Let obedience do its slow, sacred work. For when the heart is aligned with God, the mind will follow, and wisdom will rise not just as knowledge, but as a way of living rooted in faith, guided by love, and sustained by grace. Morning arrives not with questions, but with possibility. It comes softly, stretching light across the sky, offering itself before we have proven worthy of it. Morning does not ask what we did yesterday or whether we are ready today. It simply arrives, faithful and unannounced, and in that arrival God whispers again, "Begin with me." What we do in the morning shapes the way we carry ourselves through the day. Before the noise rises, before demands take their seats, before fear clears its throat, there is a holy window of surrender. Morning obedience is not about grand gestures, it is about small, faithful choices. It is the decision to place God first before placing our feet on the floor of the world. In the morning, the soul is tender. It has not yet been bruised by deadlines or divided by opinions. It is open, searching, receptive. This is why God meets us there. Obedience offered in the morning carries a purity that later hours struggle to reclaim. It says, Lord, you have my first thought, my first breath, my first trust. Morning obedience does not require perfect faith. It only asks for willingness. It asks us to rise and say, I do not know what this day will bring, but I know who I belong to. In that confession, anxiety loosens its grip, control steps aside, peace takes its place. When we obey God in the morning, we give Him the authority to order the day. We invite His wisdom into our decisions before confusion has a chance to settle in. We allow His voice to become the loudest sound we hear so that when other voices compete later, we are not easily swayed. The morning teaches us about beginnings. It reminds us that every day is a chance to start again, to choose obedience anew. Yesterday's failures do not disqualify today's faithfulness. Morning obedience is grace in motion. It allows us to move forward without dragging shame behind us. There is power in starting the day surrendered. When the heart bows early, it does not have to bow under pressure later. When we submit our plans to God at dawn, we are less shaken when those plans are interrupted by noon. Obedience in the morning builds resilience for the day's uncertainties. Morning obedience also cultivates awareness. It sharpens our sensitivity to God's guidance throughout the day. A heart that has already said yes to God in prayer is quicker to recognize His prompting in conversation, in conflict, in opportunity. Obedience early creates attentiveness later. Some days, obedience in the morning feels strong and confident. Other days, it feels fragile and whispered. But God honors both. He listens to the bold prayer and the broken one alike. What matters is not the volume of our obedience, but its sincerity. The day will test what the morning established. Temptations will arise. Frustrations will knock. Delays will challenge patience. But obedience given at sunrise becomes a compass. It reminds us where true north lies when we are tempted to wander. Morning obedience also teaches us consistency. Faith is not sustained by occasional inspiration, but by daily devotion. Each morning we obey, we reinforce the truth that God is not an accessory to our lives, but the foundation. Over time, these mornings build a life of trust. There is something sacred about meeting God before meeting the world. Before we check messages, before we chase responsibilities, before we answer to anyone else, we answer to Him. That order matters. It restores balance. It centers the soul. Morning obedience does not promise an easy day, but it promises a guided one. God does not remove every challenge. He equips us to face them with wisdom and grace. When the day becomes heavy, we remember the light we received in the morning. In the quiet of morning obedience, God often gives just enough for the day. Not the full plan. Not every answer. Just enough strength, just enough clarity, just enough peace. And that is enough. Because obedience teaches us to live one day at a time. The morning also reminds us of dependence. We wake up because God allowed it. We breathe because He sustains it. Obedience begins with gratitude for the simple miracle of being alive. From that gratitude flows humility, and from humility flows trust. When morning obedience becomes a habit, it transforms not only our days but our character. We become less reactive and more reflective. Less hurried and more intentional, less fearful and more faithful. God uses these mornings to shape who we are becoming. To obey God in the morning is to declare hope before circumstances speak. It is to believe that God is already present in the hours ahead. It is to walk into the unknown with confidence, rooted not in preparation but in trust. So let morning obedience rise like the sun, steady, faithful, and sure. Let it color the day with purpose and peace. For when we begin with God, we do not walk alone. And no matter what the day holds, we carry within us the quiet strength of a soul that chose obedience before understanding, faith before certainty, and God before everything else.